we looked at the world and we divided it into 14 million individual hexagons, down to the 2.3 kilometer level. For each of those hexagons, we're taking kind of daily weather data, climate, precipitation, cloud cover, wind cover, humidity, all that stuff. Then we figured out where 90% of the crops were being grown across these different districts for export, right? So what are 90% of all the districts in the world that are growing corn, soybeans, spinach, tomatoes for export? Then we built individual kind of machine learning models for each of the individual crops, because cocoa is very different than soy, and it's very different than tomatoes, potatoes. And it's amazing because 94% of the money, the resources, the talking points, all that is spent on this idea of sustainability and lowering our CO2 emissions and all that. And we have totally bungled that. And only 6% is spent on how do you adapt to the new world, because people are still really I think afraid of facing the reality that we now should start adapting.
Welcome to Farm to Fork, the Innovators. I'm David Maloney, president of Datum FS. With over 40 years in the food supply chain, we explore the stories and strategies transforming how we produce and serve food. Our guest innovator today is Francisco Martin Rayo, the co-founder and CEO of Helios, an innovative AI platform revolutionizing agriculture and commodities. In this episode, we dive into the current landscape of commodities, the impact of climate change on commodity supplies and markets, which commodities are most vulnerable to climate shifts, and the future of agriculture and strategies for shifting crop production areas. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and let's harvest progress together. This is Farm to Fork, the Innovators, where the future of the food supply chain starts with this episode. All right, Francisco, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So it's great to be here, David. I'm Francisco Martin Rayo. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Helios Artificial Intelligence. We're a company that helps you predict agricultural disruptions and the prices of agricultural commodities.
Before we dig into that, because commodities are near and dear to my heart, as you may know, and a lot of our listeners. How did you get in the food supply chain? Like, how did you get here? What was your journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. Many years ago, before I had gray hair, I had started, I was 21 years old. I had just graduated, and I had started this tech company with a couple of friends, and, it didn't really go anywhere. And I started another business that was importing avocados from Mexico. And so, I'm probably the only AI CEO that can talk at length about where the best avocados come from and, how the industry's changed and all that. But that was really my first foray into the, this fascinating world of this global agricultural supply chain. And then, from there, we can talk about kind of the journey, but that was really kind of the first nuance. What's interesting is my co-founder, our CTO, Eden Janalar, her formal title obviously has been as this like really senior AI ML engineer, and she won the Abby Award and all that. But she also owned a restaurant, and so it was when we first came together, we had that weird kind of tech and food, restaurant, agri-food background, which was kind of nice.
Yeah, and for those who might be watching on YouTube, you might notice that I am in our restaurant's storage office. Moving away from my seat where the window is so you don't hear the dishes clanging and stuff like that. Yeah. So who has the best avocados? Is it Mexico, California? If Mexico, then where?
I mean, I think I have a personal preference for California avocados. I think closely seconded by Mexico. What was so interesting at the time is that California used to have this, just so you can see how valuable tech can be. California had this technology that would basically do like, I think, ultraviolet lens or something, where you could see how ripe the avocado was at scale. And, Mexican processing plants had a little machine that would tap the avocado to see if it was too green or too. And that's how they would do it. But it was such a dramatic difference, right, in terms of how the different countries approached agriculture and the level of investment they could put in.
Yeah. All right. Great point. So you got into the food supply chain, right, after avocados, and you talk about commodity disruptions, right? I mean, I guess we're all kind of used to commodity disruptions, whether that's drought, whether that's too much rain, whether that's right now there's very few cows, beef cows, dairy cows out there, and hamburger prices are a lot higher. Like, so what from your purview, right, did you see was the major challenge that attracted you into this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit depressing. Our main hypothesis was, we've really bungled climate change. Every new piece of information that comes out there is, the world is getting a lot hotter than we expect. We're on track now to hit between 2.5 and 2.8 degrees centigrade, which is extraordinary in a really negative way. We're nowhere near the 1.5 degrees centigrade that we had agreed on at the Paris Agreement. There's more CO2 pollution happening last year than ever before on a per capita basis. There are more coal plants in China that are built every year than all of the coal plants in the United States. And, we just saw that there was no chance that we were going to flatten this curve. And our big bet was, one of the places that's going to be hit hardest is going to be agriculture, because you can only grow fruits and vegetables and grains and all that within certain ranges that they're used to. And so we figured that at the same time, you were seeing this incredible evolution in artificial intelligence. And you had the advent of satellites. And so you had access to weather information at a granular basis that was impossible before. Our big bet was that we could build an AI platform that could better predict where these agricultural disruptions were going to happen. And once you can predict that, then you can start to predict prices for cocoa and soybeans and palm oil and spinach and tomatoes and all that stuff.
Cool. And just for the sake of our listeners, and quite honestly, myself, can you define an AI platform? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, we may be thinking like traditionally data digesting, cleaning and mapping, and some sort of BI tool on top of it, right? Is the way we've typically digested data, right? What's the difference? What is an AI platform?
The way we think about an AI platform is really an ensemble of different techniques. Some of them are very basic, ordinary data science. And then some are much more advanced in terms of like some of the machine learning models that we've done for each of the individual crops. And so the platform for us is really kind of the ensemble of all of those different parts. And then we've created this overlay so that it's easy for folks to be able to access those insights. And we have another layer of generative AI so that, you have almost this co-pilot, if you will, generating those insights for you, which you can then intake and figure out, what it means for your purchasing decisions, sourcing decisions. But, David, specifically to your answer, right? Like one of the things that I think is important is, as some of your listeners are thinking of what software to buy, et cetera, use AI where it's most helpful, right? Like if a basic statistical analysis will do that, right? If you need, the cutting edge machine learning models, great. If you need generative AI, great, do that. But don't necessarily overcomplicate it just because it's sexy.
Great point. Great point. Yeah, I think we've all had a tendency to do that at some point in our lives. Yeah. So can you walk us through just briefly, like you talked about this revolution in AI. What's happened? Why is AI so popular right now?
Yeah. The most surprising thing, and Eden, my co-founder, and I talk about this all the time, it's not that we got a lot smarter or devised a new framework for machine learning. What you really saw over the last 10 years was we had the ability to compute at much higher levels than ever before. And we had access to a lot more data than ever before, which allowed for training of these models in a really unique way. So, a really good example is if I want to train a computer vision program to identify cats, I am going to feed it, 100 million pictures of cats. And it's going to look through all these images, and eventually it's like, all right, now I understand what a cat looks like. And if I give it, non-training data and I say, in this picture, which are the cats, it should be able to identify the cats. That's basically what we're still doing. Obviously, there's places that are much more exciting than this, but at a basic level, what we were able to do is we were able to look at those 100 million pictures of cats a lot faster than ever before. And we were able to ingest basically the internet, which was what OpenAI did, and get a lot more data than ever before. And that's really what has blown up our ability to start to see some of these insights really start to generate kind of the generative part of artificial intelligence.
Interesting. So I was recently listening to a podcast with the CEO of Duolingo.
Yeah.
And
love Duolingo. That's how I learned German.
Great.
Yeah,
And Pittsburgh's
Pittsburgh.
current Carnegie Mellon guys, if I remember correctly,
Yep, yeah,
which is,
yeah.
I don't know if you know this, that's where I'm from. And most of the listeners know
Incredible robotics university.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a Yinzer. That's what we call ourselves from Pittsburgh.
So,
Anyways, he was saying that because of this, I'll use your term revolution, projects that 8 years ago that they wanted to try would have taken maybe 3 to 5 years, now are taking 3 to 5 months. And so
yeah.
they're able to do more and test more. And he said it's really, and it's likely to get any faster. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. I just had lunch with another CEO in the consulting industry, and they're thinking of starting this new kind of AI product business and all that. And they hadn't yet understood the shift where they were thinking of starting this without a true kind of CTO. And they said, well, we don't really need a CTO. We'll just get some dev teams and, everything's getting so much easier and so much faster. And, the argument that we had was, if you don't have someone who can oversee your technology and artificial intelligence strategy, you're going to fall so much further behind than everybody else because the barriers to entry will just continue to lower and lower and lower.
Mhm.
Um, and it really is a dramatic rethinking of how fast you can test and iterate and push product out, how fast you can do things. It's been extraordinary.
Cool. And that's exciting for me because some people may know, just because I mentioned this before, my oldest child, a son, is a data science major at the University of Florida and is writing models, etc. And yeah, matter of fact, he'll be in the restaurant for work in a little bit, so he's on my break. So
My son's 3.5 and he's still learning how to swim. So maybe we can get him to data science in a couple decades.
yeah, cool. So tell us more about Helios. So the overall premise is, hey, look, we've got this climate change, and yes, make no mistake, there are some really exciting things that are happening, not just in the United States, but worldwide. But I'll focus United States, where we focused on before, whether that's regenerative agriculture. I did an episode recently with a distribution company, how they're taking steps to get carbon negative, or better than carbon negative, over the next, I think, 10 years. So there's some exciting things going on, but the world is a lot bigger than these efforts, if I hear you correctly.
Yep.
Is that fair?
I think that's 1,000% right. Two things that we really are very excited about as a company and worry about as human beings, right? Um, what we built is amazing. I mean, we became famous because we predicted the increase in cocoa prices months before the market. We recently predicted this kind of increase in mandarin prices for a very large customer that probably sells all the mandarins you're ever going to buy. And they were able to just, save 15%, buy 12 months worth of the mandarins they wanted. And so what we've done is, in the places where climate is the primary driver of price and is creating these supply disruptions, we are better than any other company or platform in the world, period. And we will just continue to get better. What's interesting is climate is becoming the primary driver of these price changes because of the acceleration of climate change. And so when we talk to folks like, I don't know, name your favorite beer company, they've probably spent hundreds of millions of dollars around the world building infrastructure to process and import and export and build out from the different places they're sourcing hops and barley and all that stuff. What if you can no longer grow barley or hops in those places? And you have to start to build that infrastructure somewhere else. But it's not just the infrastructure. You have to build out that capacity in that new country. That's the stuff that we've started to help with. We have a product called Climate Audits. But that's really the type of rethinking that these senior kind of procurement and sourcing leaders need to start to do. That's the stuff that is really dramatically different than anything we've seen before. A good example are fruit trees, right? Peaches and apples and all that. Fruit trees need what's called a certain number of cooling hours, where you need it to be cold enough during the winter so that the tree rests. And then once, spring comes, it gets all excited again. It puts out its flowers, and then flowers create fruits and all that stuff. But your winters are either shorter and or warmer. And so they don't get enough cooling hours, which means they don't create the flowers, which means you don't get the fruit. And it takes you 3 to 5 years to plant a tree and start
Right.
be able to harvest it. So these are some of the issues over the next 10 years that we really have to grapple with as a humanity, as a global food chain that we were really built to help with.
Yeah, and to your point, I interviewed Stephanie Pazzalia with seafood industry, and she talked about how the fishermen are now having to chase. I mean, it might chase fish north,
Yeah.
like they're disappearing from their normal areas, and they have to chase them north.
Yeah.
And so my point there would be is, you know, to those who may say, "Hey, wait a minute, how long? 10 years, 20 years? It's happening today, right? Is that
Yeah.
fair?"
I think that's exactly right. I think that's the biggest surprise. We the biggest surprise for us is studying the acceleration of climate change, and for people who do this and have been doing this for 20 years, is how quickly it changed. Even if you ask the biggest pessimists, they felt that we still had time, and we had well, we can still bend the curve, and we're still it's over. It's We need to learn to adapt. I mean, David, I know we've talked about this, but we were at New York's Climate Week, which is this kind of boondoggle of sorts. It's similar to like COP, the convention of the parties happens every year, and all these famous people come in and talk about climate change. And somewhere this year it was at Baku. And it's amazing because 94% of the money, the resources, the talking points, all that is spent on this idea of sustainability and lowering our CO2 emissions and all that. And we have totally bungled that. And only 6% is spent on how do you adapt to the new world, because people are still really, I think, afraid of facing the reality that we now should start adapting. And you
Yeah.
should probably switch that. You should spend 94% of your resources and time figuring out how to adapt, rather than in this failed exercise that we've had over the last couple of decades, trying to flatten the curve that people just don't really seem interested in, right? We hadn't made any progress.
Yeah. I'd offer, I think that from the consumer standpoint, whether we're the food service industry or if I'm speaking about food, or the grocery industry or the suppliers behind it, generally we've confused the consumer. And whether that's organic, and these are all very good things, grass fed, pasture raised, whatever it may be, the consumer, I'm confused, right? I'm confused, and I'm in this space, right? And it makes it really hard for the consumer to make those purposeful choices at times,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah,
and I think we've kind of that lost connection is one of the reasons we've bungled it. But I mean, is it fair to say that if I hear you correctly, we shouldn't give up on trying to slow climate change, but we also have to be planning for the future, of the reality of the future, the likely reality of the future. Is that fair?
that's exactly right. Yeah, I think we should not give up, but we really need to start spending a lot more time figuring out how to adapt, and that means, where are you growing certain crops that you aren't growing them right now? What should you be eating differently? Where should you be building your cities? How should you build them differently? Um, at least specific to what we do in the agri-food sector, uh, you're going to have to completely rethink where and how you're sourcing from these regions.
Interesting. So before we get into that a little more, what data are you digesting? So you mentioned weather, right? So can you walk us through how you digest that weather data,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then also, what other data are you digesting to run your models?
Yeah, we've got what was really unique about what we did and why it's so successful is we looked at the world and we divided it into 14 million individual hexagons, down to the 2.3 kilometer level. For each of those hexagons, we're taking kind of daily weather data, climate, precipitation, cloud cover, wind cover, humidity, all that stuff. Then we figured out where 90% of the crops were being grown across these different districts for export, right? So what are 90% of all the districts in the world that are growing corn, soybeans, spinach, tomatoes for export? Then we built individual kind of machine learning models for each of the individual crops, because cocoa is very different than soy. It's very different than tomatoes, potatoes. And then the last part, and this was, I think, the most unique piece of technology we've done, we created what we call 81 climate archetypes. And so we characterized each of these little hexagons based on latitude and longitude and altitude, soil type, obviously temperature, humidity. And then we used that to compare each of the hexagons against all of the other hexagons in the world that look like it. So that way, what it allows you to do is basically mitigate for climate change. So you're not comparing how did that hexagon do over the last 10 years. You're comparing how does that hexagon compare to all of the other hexagons around the world that look like it. And then you're really able to identify what the anomaly is. Because you don't really care if it's too hot in Brazil for oranges. You care if it's too hot in Brazil for oranges at this particular time. Sorry, you don't really care if it's too hot in Brazil, right? You need that level of specificity. Is it too hot in this place for this crop at this time?
So which hexagons are performing the best? What area of the world do you know are performing the best? And what might you say, what area of the world do you think needs the most work?
It depends. That's the
Okay.
beauty of the system, right? That there's so much nuance there. We did some work for a large fruit juice manufacturer. And they asked us to look at, they were sourcing grapefruits from Spain. And, Spain has been in a relative drought for the last 6 years or so. And what's interesting is, we predict that drought to continue. So temperatures will get hotter, but not above a certain range, right? And you'll have less rain. But what's surprising is if you were buying fresh grapefruit from Spain, that's really bad. You're going to end up with these kind of gnarly, smaller looking grapefruits that people pay less for. But if you're buying grapefruit juice, that's excellent because climate change in this particular case actually makes the grapefruits a little bit sweeter. It increases the Brix content. And so this is the type of nuance I think that is often lost when people make these big pronouncements.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, and folks, just to bring this home for maybe those who aren't buying grapefruits or oranges, and I'm sure we're going to dig in more of this, but if we talk about the impact of climate change on something as big as cattle or beef here in the United States, cattle and beef supplies are very tight. Yes, that cattle traditionally has a cycle, a build and contract cycle, but due to market incentives mostly, but there are tremendous market incentives for the cattle herd to build right now. Record cattle prices. Tremendous market financial incentives. The problem is they can't because they don't have grass. It's too dry. We're in like year 4 of very, very subpar weather and drought in the southern plains of the United States. And so it's greatly, greatly impacting prices. And also back to your point, kind of saying we still need to try to mitigate climate change. We've still got to learn how to do that because if not, even though we're shifting production, we're going to keep shifting production, right?
Yeah.
So we still got to learn how to mitigate, right?
Yeah. And this is what's so interesting, right? To your point on cattle, most of the models out there that are trying to predict where the price of beef is going to come from, they look at somewhat simplistic supply and demand characteristics, right? How many cattle are there? What's the economic growth in China? The richer they are, right? The more beef they'll eat. Are we in a recession? So on and so forth. They don't and haven't needed to take climate into consideration because you'd figure out there was, the only limiting factor was how many cows you had and how much beef people wanted to eat. But now, exactly to your point, you can't have more cows because there isn't enough grass to feed them. And the only way to get more grass is either you move the cow somewhere where you're growing grass more regularly or you get out of a drought.
Yeah. So in your system, you have weather alerts, etc., but you also have forecasts for supplies and prices of commodities. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. So what commodities are you covering? Does it have to be a field crop? Does it have to be?
I have 58. We have 58 commodities across 85 countries.
Okay.
And what's been really interesting is, some of the pushback we got, especially initially from some hedge fund clients was, well, how good can this possibly be if what you're really driving for is climate. And so we did back testing of this against, futures prices over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's a 70% effectiveness. That'll continue to increase, we imagine, as climate, again, becomes the primary driver of where these prices are going. But I think that's why we're able to support these large enterprises so holistically, because we're not only giving you grains and oilseeds, we're giving you grains, oilseeds, and then, lettuce and tomatoes, potatoes, onions. We'll start moving into, beef, poultry, eggs pretty shortly. So
Oh,
we're
good.
excited for that.
Avocados?
Oh, definitely avocados. Yeah, first thing we did. It's founder bias, as they say.
Right,
Founder bias.
right. So how do you think about forecasting supplies and prices? Are you comparing year on year? Are you, and in your prices, are these spot markets, futures markets, both, et cetera? Like, how do you kind of settle in on those?
It's futures markets and spot markets.
Okay.
And the way we think about it is we look at kind of previous yields, and then we're able to give you an indication of how good or how bad the yield will be, really at a regional level, country level, global level. And then we're able to give you an indication, is there upward pressure, downward pressure, kind of neutral pressure. And that's been, listen, there's a lot of nuance in pricing commodities, especially non-exchange traded commodities, right? You ask 10 people for the price of cocoa, they'll all give you one price, whatever is the give or take, right? Whatever's most recent on the exchange. You ask 10 people for the price of mandarins and they'll give you 10 different prices. But what is helpful is having this information allows you to get ahead of, all right, we know that Peru is going to have really bad mango harvest. And so maybe we should start looking at other places. And we know that if they have a really terrible mango harvest, the price is probably going to go up at least 2x.
So is that true? Or are you just using it as an example?
No, that was what happened last season. Peru had a terrible harvest. We predicted it a few months for, I think the overall harvest was down 80% in Tambo Grande. Prices went up by 2.2x. This year we're, again, just to be really transparent, we're really worried about mangoes in Brazil. We're seeing some of the same issues as before. Incredibly hot winter, not enough cooling hours. We've told our customers to start looking at alternative suppliers who are not in Brazil for mango.
So mangoes in Brazil. What other commodities do you see most at risk right now?
Apples. We worry a lot about apples in Poland.
Okay.
There was a terrible cranberry harvest in the United States. We predicted that about a month before. Mandarins in China, we talked about. And then one of the places we're really focused on is cocoa.
Yeah.
And the reason for cocoa and palm and even vanilla, what's unique about those types of commodities is that there's relatively few countries that you can source this from.
Yeah.
And what happens then is if any one of these countries is unable to grow or has drought or, even too much rain, too hot, too cold, whatever it is, it really throws kind of the whole supply system off base. And what's interesting is for most of these places, they're grown in relatively tropical or temperate climates. And so you didn't have to worry about climate for a very long time. That's why they didn't create this diversified cocoa supply chain, for example, right? That's why Colombia's a very small player. Indonesia is a very small player, right? The market still is driven off of Ivory Coast and Ghana.
Mm-hmm. Which, oh, by the way, are very close to each other, right?
Yeah. And it takes 5 years, David, right, to start harvesting your cocoa tree. We really worry about that kind of stuff. It's the places that are highly concentrated and the places where it takes a long time to be able to re-up the harvest. Coffee is a good example. We work with a Brazilian grower. They've got about 5,000 hectares, relatively small. And they've planted coffee trees twice over the last few years, and they've all been killed through frost unexpectedly. And so, their big question is, do we continue to grow coffee here? Or is the climate changing to the degree where, it takes me 5 years to make my money back on that coffee tree. And then I need it to be productive for another, 5 or 10 years.
Before we leave, because you mentioned this earlier about planning your supply chain. Where's my manufacturing facilities going to be? What ports am I going to go have? Before we lean into that, are there certain commodities that you feel better about or the best about right now?
Yeah, I would say not specific commodities, but what I feel good about is commodities that can be sourced across multiple countries that don't require a number of years to bear fruit. Those are the things that we feel real, like potatoes, right? You had a really bad harvest in the UK, Belgium, and France last year, right? Lots of precipitation made it difficult to harvest. Lots of rain makes the potatoes really fat. You put them into storage and they get moldy and you lose, another 4% of them. So 4% and 4% on the harvest. But you can still grow potatoes in South Africa and in Mongolia and China, the United States, et cetera, et cetera. Relatively diversified, raspberries as well, right? You can grow them in Serbia, you can grow them in Canada, you can grow them in the United States. Those are the places that I think are more sustainable. Large diversified supply chains, things that you can plant seasonally.
And so I would assume that part of this adaptation to climate change might be an adaptation of our diets.
Really great point. Yeah. We saw this with the shrinkflation over Halloween, right? Maybe you're not eating a chocolate bar. Maybe it's chocolate and raspberries now. And maybe it's 50% raspberries because you had a really good crop.
Yeah.
That is, almonds. I have a pet peeve with almonds because a lot of people understandably said, all right, cows create a lot of methane. We should eat fewer beef products. Makes sense. Let's move to almond milk. It's better for you, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is almonds are so water thirsty. So you have these incredible thousands and thousands and thousands of acres in California of almond farms.
Mm-hmm.
And we were exporting like 90% of that to China because they really like almonds. And what you're basically doing is you're exporting California's groundwater to China. That's the stuff where I think we should take a stronger look as consumers, right? I'm not advocating for more regulation, but as consumers and say, should I really be having almond milk if I really care about the environment? Maybe have regular milk, maybe have soy milk, right? Other options, but at least take that into consideration.
Well, I mean, this is going to be a total dad joke right here. Sorry, Francisco. And I don't know if you're old enough for this, but sometimes you feel like a nut and sometimes you don't. Do you know that
I
candy
remember,
bar?
was it the Planters? Yeah.
No, it
No,
was
which was it from?
Almond Joy.
That was
Almond
it.
Joy.
Almond Joy.
Almond Joy candy bar. So, which is a great candy bar, by the way.
It's a great candy bar. They make it in dark chocolate now.
Oh, really? I have to check that out.
I've had an almond joy in dark chocolate. It's my favorite Halloween candy. Yeah.
Yeah. But you bring up something, a choice as consumers, and I just think, golly, it's so hard to understand. I mean, this is probably the third or fourth time I'm going to tell this story on a podcast episode, but I'm not going to name names, but it is a very well-known organic climate-centered grocery store chain that is selling pasture-raised beef. And when I look at it and I see how good the marbling is, I know to ask, okay, has this been through a feedlot or not? Right. And they're like, well, yeah, it's been through a feedlot, but they still market as pasture. So my point is, it's not standardized. And I'm not saying I'm not a big regulation guy, but I think the consumers are confused and it's just hard to make those choices. And let's face it, it's not just about the planet. In a lot of cases, it's also about their own health as they make those choices.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the point you made initially, right? Like if you're a consumer, where do you even get the information to make the right choices? I mean, the easy part is like eat more fruits and vegetables. Okay. Yeah. Those are pretty good. But, do you do only my favorite? I had this conversation with the head of regenerative agriculture at one of the top 3 CPGs. And his view was, listen, there are no easy solutions. If everybody stops, if all everybody wanted to eat was fruits and vegetables and soy milk, well, then you have to start growing a lot more fruits and vegetables. And there's some deforestation that will happen, right? I think it's the extremes that really get you, right? If try and find that balance, that seasonal balance, if you can. That's probably at this point, right? Just given all the information that's out there, that's probably a good guiding strategy.
Yeah, do the best you can. Because you're right, because part of our climate problem is because of the soils. We're not treating the soils well, right? And we need those ruminant animals to help the soil, right? But it's not the animals themselves, it's the how we're using these animals in some cases, right?
I completely agree. We work with the second largest buyer of pineapples in the world. And they import a lot of pineapples from Southeast Asia. And they're starting to see yield differences. Perfectly good season, temperature-wise, climate-wise. And, the hypothesis is it's because the soils are nearing their end, right? And so how do you figure that out? If you've used, incredible technology has occurred in the agriculture space. It really is amazing, right? How much more productive it's become with new types of fertilizers and new types of nutrients and new types of trees. But what if you're getting to the kind of the peak yield, and then you just need to give the soil a break or you need to regenerate it, right? But that could take years, right? It takes 3 years, I think, to go from a conventional field to an organic field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as we wind down here, Francisco, maybe 2 last questions for you, excuse me. Walk us through kind of the platform, if you will, you're offering. So people might say, okay, I kind of get it, but what are you selling here, Francisco, right?
Yeah.
And then lastly from you, what does the food supply chain look just briefly 10 years from now?
Yeah. So one, I love talking about our products, so thank you for the opportunity. If you are a procurement, sourcing, category manager, and you have a global agri-food supply chain, come talk to us. And we will help you do 2 things. We will help you better forecast where disruptions are going to happen in your supply chain. We're going to help you better forecast what the prices of these different commodities are in the near term. And most important, or as part of it rather, we're going to help you understand where over the next 10 years you're most at risk. And you're going to need to start to move away from certain places and start to make investment in other places. At its core, that's what we do. The fact that it's AI is cool and it makes it much more effective. But at its core, we are here to help and live with and support the people who run our global supply chain, because otherwise the world will end up with stockouts and food insecurity and all that stuff. We're really passionate about helping these folks. And what is amazing is that we have spoken to hundreds of companies in the space. Everyone is underfunded, understaffed, overburdened. I mean, these are not the fat places and the corporate structure.
Yeah.
In terms of the second part, what does it look like 10 years from now? I unfortunately think you probably end up with a lot more volatility, a higher number of agricultural disruptions, a higher number of crop failures, and a lot more price volatility. I think what we've seen in cocoa over the last 12, 18 months, an incredible rise, and then it drops back down, and now it's fluctuating again. That's probably where we're going to end up for a lot of other commodities. Right. And that makes it really difficult to plan. That's why we're here. We're here to help.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Francisco. Thank you for being on the show. Great conversation and congratulations.
Awesome. Great to be here. Thanks, David.
And that brings us to the end of another insightful journey through the fields of innovation on Farm to Fork, The Innovators. It's an honor to have you listen. If you found today's episode as fascinating as we did, don't forget to share it with a friend, write a review, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode. Farm to Fork is not just a podcast, it's a community of forward thinkers and change makers. Your thoughts and ideas matter to us. Reach out on social media or through our website, datamfs.com, and be a part of the ongoing conversation. As we wrap up today, remember, the future of the food supply chain is in our hands. Stay curious, stay innovative, and let's continue growing together. Until next time, this is David Maloney signing off from Farm to Fork, The Innovators. Thank you for being a part of this community. See you in the next episode.